All right. I'm going to talk to you about risk of unintentional biological soil amendments of animal origin contamination. So we've talked a lot about amendments, which is the intentional application of either a raw product or a treated product to an agricultural field for some purpose. And while that's really important, and that's the major area of the subpart that we focused on for most of this workshop, there are other ways that our produce fields can become contaminated beyond just the intentional application of that as an amendment. And so while we're primarily amending for the purpose of developing, our production management system, making sure that we're applying for the benefits of what that amendment can provide, there can be a number of other issues that develop on farm given exposure to biological material like manure and waste from other types of exposure. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go through today. So there can be presence of biological issues like manure that's spread through a number of different sources. So you may have animals on farm that if you're a diversified farm, you have cattle, you may have sheep, goats, rabbits, chickens, a number of different types of animals on farm. You more than likely are dealing with some level of wildlife intrusion on your farm. So we'll talk about some of those risks. Your farmland, how it is set up, so the topography of the land, what's in surrounding areas, how you move across that property to do your activities, especially if you're a diversified operation, what types of tools and equipment and how you maintain those, your irrigation systems and how they're maintained, and the water sources that you're using in regards to how you're managing your production on your farm, and then the sources that you're pulling that water from, and then neighboring lands, what's happening around your property that could be impacting your produce fields. And then what about water sources? So are there surface waters nearby, streams, lakes? Do you have ponds on your property? Do your neighbors have ponds? What happens when it rains or floods? And then some other emerging issues. So I like to talk to our growers who attend our produce safety program. We first cover what is in the regulation, and I think we've done a really great job over the last couple of days covering, what's in subpart F, how that applies to the industry, how important it is. But I also think that it's really helpful for us to really get down to the nitty gritty and talk about, well, what does this mean on the farm? How does this look when I'm looking at my operation if you're a farmer? And what does it mean to the practices that farmers need to put in place or to change or to pay attention to make sure that they're not creating unintentional contamination on their farm? So here you see, if we're talking about applying raw manure, oftentimes we're talking about using organic practices for farming. And so here's a study published in 2018 on a survey sent out to organic farmers regarding their biological soil amendments of animal origin, their use. So what do they use? How do they use it? And as you can see from the table that's provided here, this was conducted across the country. Research all over, and particularly if we look at the South, which is where our program is being held, we do have people registered from all over the country that are on with us today. But let's just take a look at what's happening in the South in regards to what types of biological soil amendments we're using. So in the South column, you can see about 86% say they use some type of animal manure. 17% say animal products. And when we're distinguishing between animal manure and animal products, the products are what you see on the bottom left of this table, which are going to be like the bone meal, feather meal, fish emulsion, and other things like that. The green and animal manure products are going to be a combination of things like food waste, vegetable scraps, combined with some form of animal manure. And so under that category in the first column, you can see that these are raw, untreated sources. And about 85% of those that were surveyed in the South say that they're using some form of untreated. In regards to composting, we had about 89% in the South saying that they were using an animal manure that had been composted. And you can see the other data in that section. And then if you go down to the types of treated animal products, fish emulsion was probably, that's one of the highest sources considered to be a treated animal product that our organic growers were reporting. Now, these were small samples, may or may not be representative of what's happening in the South broadly, but just informative. So since we're talking about unintentional risk of contamination on farm, it's going to be really important to pay attention to how we manage amendments or manage unintentional exposure to manure on our operation or wildlife intrusion and all of those things. So when we're talking about storage and handling of what we're planning to amend our fields with, 80% of organic growers that were surveyed in the same study said that they store their manure in some type of stockpile. And there's a picture here on the bottom left of what an example of storage could look like. If it's going to be raw manure or composted manure, it is a good management practice to cover that with some type of cover. This can be tarping, it can be contained indoors, other types of ways to protect that from any kind of water, so that you don't end up with an issue with runoff or if you have wildlife intrusion into that stockpile. We also see that about 16% said they had some level of storage in a pit or slurry. That's probably going to be related to if they have livestock, such as hogs on their farm. They're going to be maybe holding that and using that for a purpose later. We see that 14% said that they were holding their amendments in containers or indoor, and then 9% said they had no storage system. So Eric did a great job of talking about the 3-bin compost system yesterday and the windrow system yesterday. But if you're planning to hold compost on your farm, you do need to think about, once it's a finished product, how you're going to be holding and storing that to prevent the potential for future contamination, which a couple of our speakers mentioned yesterday as well. And as part of our program, we had an opportunity to go out to Oklahoma to visit a large mushroom operation that uses this windrow composting system. And while they're making their compost, it's going to be out in the open. They're going to be managing it, checking it for temperatures, getting it to where it needs to be. But then once it gets to that finished state, they would store it in a building similar to the barn that you see over here to the left, where it's got kind of a concrete base, it's covered, rainwater can't get in, and they would hold that until they were ready to use that for the mushroom operation. So when we're talking about unintentional risk, if farms are diversified and they have animals on farm, and this can be livestock or poultry, and we'll talk about a few others in just a moment, but if farms are going to have animals on farm, you need to think about the management plan to prevent the unintentional contamination from those animals onto the produce fields. And so I'd like to have people just enter into the chat. If you were a diversified farming operation and you had cattle on your farm and you also had fruit and vegetable production on your farm, what are some potential risks to having cattle near a fruit and vegetable production system? So does anyone want to put something in the chat? All right, so if they're stacking manure, or if they're in fields and manure is just in the field, that can definitely be a runoff issue. Natural mulches to prevent splashing and moving. Foot traffic, very important. So thinking about how you're moving across a property. So let's say you are a diversified farm and you have cattle and you need to harvest vegetables to get those to a farmer's market or a farm stand, or even a wholesale operation where you're going to be moving a large amount of produce off of your operation. If you're working cattle in the morning and then you're walking those dirty green boots out into that field, you could be spreading manure into your fields. What we talk about in our full day produce safety program is making sure that you have dedicated boots so you're not, walking through those fields. Not sharing equipment, foot baths, changing clothes, those are all really important. Thinking about wind-blown contamination. So if you do have a smaller operation with less land and you are having cattle in more of a confined area or other types of livestock in barns or confined areas, we've been out to a farm where the farm was in the rolling hills of western Arkansas. They had several different types of livestock and poultry, and they had their barns on top of the hill. So as we were talking about in the chat, just what some of those risks were and how people moving around the farm and how that can create potential contamination. So Samantha, if you could just click one more time, we're going to talk about this next example here of pastured poultry. So you guys had some really great points in the chat for issues that could come up with the cattle operation. So what are some of the things, if you've got this pastured poultry operation, that could contribute to the spread of pathogens in dealing with this pastured poultry example we have here? So just enter that in the chat as well. All right. If it's concentrated, it kind of depends on how big of a field you have, and it depends on where your pastured poultry is. We'll talk a little bit about rotational grazing in just a little bit and how that can spread. It can be potentially appealing to wildlife. Very good point. Chickens can run through the fields. It depends on, how well those areas are fenced. You can see some pretty good fencing there in the back. Okay, so these are all really good examples. And then is that a hoop house in the background? Actually, no, it's just another one of these little chicken tractors for more poultry. So a good eye there. Okay, Samantha, you can go on to the next slide. Runoff and leaching depends on the density or, how many head of poultry you have, and Carl could probably speak to some of that as well. So one of the practices that we see farms doing, and this is a really good practice, is rotational grazing. So if you have the luxury of having the space on your farm to be able to kind of develop these kind of contained areas where you might have your livestock or your poultry held in an area for a period of time, and then you can produce your crops in certain areas and then rotate your cattle and your poultry into other areas. So while this can be seen as a favorable practice, because one, it provides additional nutrition to your livestock and your poultry. They can go into a field that was in production for produce, and they can graze those crop residues and, increase their access to more nutrients. But then at the same time, they're going to be depositing that manure while they're grazing. It can be, just as we've heard about over the last couple of days, a great source for fertility and organic matter that can, down the road lead to healthier soils. But if you're going to be growing crops on a field that has been in production for rotational grazing, you really need to think about, those fecal deposits and the interval period of time for when those the livestock or poultry are in the field. So it's going to be important to pay attention to how soon can you grow a crop in that field, a produce crop, and it be safe for consumption to leave the farm. And so I kind of primed, Samantha, you can go on to the next slide. I kind of primed Dave for this in the talk before, because I knew it was coming up in my slides. But, growers are often encouraged to follow the National Organic Program standards, because we are waiting for additional guidance from FDA on kind of what an interval period should be. But people are using this rule for rotational grazing as well. And just to remind everyone what that standard is. So a minimum of 120 days prior to harvest when the edible portion of the crop has soil contact. So you've got 120 days if you're going to be growing something that's going to be on the ground that might come in contact with the soil. And then if it's going to be grown above the ground, so like say tomatoes or something like that, 90 days prior to that. And then, so these are the recommendations. There's, we're still waiting to kind of hear, what the science is going to be for that. So it may not be enough time to establish safety. It depends on, what you do to those fields. So if you're going to be doing rotational grazing, and then you're going to come in and you're going to till that cattle manure or that chicken poultry into the soil, and then you're going to wait a period of time before you plant and then harvest, at least 120 days. But as Dave pointed out, there's kind of a sweet spot. You don't want to wait too long, and you don't want to have too little time. And so it can be a great production management practice, but it's something to pay attention to in regards to the time intervals.
Amanda, we have a question for you in the chat.
Sure.
What is a safe distance between farm animals and produce? The farm is 50 acres and want to use a portion for animals. What would you recommend?
We are going to go through an example in just a moment to look at some of that. We'll talk about that when we get to that section because it depends on a lot of factors. And what you have in between the animals and the produce. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. But I did want to point out, in addition to, just cattle, sheep, goats, if you have horses on farm, they're pretty good waste producers. And so here's a great resource from our friends at Michigan Extension talking about how much a single 1,000-pound horse can produce. So 50 pounds of manure per day. That's a lot of waste. And so how are you going to be managing that? So if you are a small diversified operation, or if you're even a larger operation and you also have horses on your property, you need to think about the contribution of that manure to your property. How are you managing that? Are you spreading it on croplands? Are you, selling it to your neighbors? Are you stockpiling it? Are you composting it? What practices are you putting in place to manage that as well? So a single horse in 1 year can fill up a 12-foot by 12-foot and 6 feet deep stall of manure. So that's a lot of waste. And horses are allowed under the produce safety rule for a working role. But if you're going to be using like draft horses for production, you need to think about that interval for when that horse is on the field as well. And then consider how your property is set up. What's the lay of the land? Are you going to have any runoff related to where your horses are stored? Another factor in unintentional exposure is a lot of the farms that we work with do have dogs as working animals on their farm to deal with keeping deer out of their fields, to deal with coyotes that might try to attack their livestock, things like that. But you need to think about the potential contribution that your working dogs might have by dropping fecal matter into your produce fields as well. As part of our full day training for the produce safety rule, we go into the details of like looking for, prior to harvest, any fecal matter and making sure that you're not harvesting produce that has any signs of that. So what are some of the ways to manage the risk of this contamination? So the first thing to really think about, other than just the animals on the farm and your amendments, is really the lay of the land. And I think Carl was getting into some of this when he was answering questions during my break. So the topography of the land, is it flatlands? Is it hilled? Are there forested areas? Do you have lots of surface water, lakes, ponds, streams, rivers? How does that move through your property? How close is it to your produce fields? Do you have forests that could attract wildlife? Do you have buffers, in conservation practices, which Carl talked about the NRCS, you can get grants to put in conservation lands and vegetative buffers between streams and things like that. What are the pros and cons of putting those types of practices in place? Because if you do that, you may or may not attract more wildlife. You may control for one problem, but it could develop another problem. So if you do have a property that slopes or has issues with drainage or things like that, you need to really pay attention how water is moving across your property. So in the picture, you can see here, this is an organic farm. They are on a slope, so it's a little bit of a terraced garden. So if you had livestock uphill, or if your neighbors did, that could present a problem. So some practices that farms are putting in place are to berm or to ditch or trench so that water can be moved away from our production areas. And those are ways to manage risk. Other things to consider, and folks had put this in the chat when we were on the cattle example, would be to consider how you direct the flow of traffic around your farm. So what are farm chores? If you're a diversified farm, going out and feeding the cattle, as well as, if you're going to be in the produce fields, how are you moving around your property? How is your equipment and tools being moved around your property? How are you storing things? Where's your compost pile? If you have coals of produce, are you storing that just out in the open, or are you attracting wildlife? And then how are you moving your manure to make your compost and things like that? And then also washing of tools and equipment, washing of your produce. How does water move away from those activities? So tools and equipment. So how are you storing tools and equipment? How are you cleaning and sanitizing tools and equipment? As you can see here on the left, you've got kind of an open air shed, which is kind of a common practice for storing any kind of larger equipment. So this is, probably more of a smaller scale equipment, but if you've got tractors, where are you storing those? Are you cleaning those between things? So if you're moving manure, and then you are planning to use your tractor for other purposes, could you be causing issues with how you move that tractor around your property? The same is true with some of our smaller tools like shovels. And are you cleaning and sanitizing those? Are you dedicating those for certain purposes? One of the practices that we've seen that's really helpful is to color code tools and equipment, so that the things that you use for your livestock and poultry or manure management are not mixed with the tools that you use for your vegetable production practices. And here's just an example of the Never Sink Farm, who has done they've got some really great resources, and they put out a few courses on this, but they've got a really clean operation. And one of the things you can see is they have a covered area for their tools. They generally keep them off of the ground. They have, you can see on the right-hand corner, they have trash cans out there with lids that they empty regularly. They have a washing area on their property that's away from their field, so water doesn't go back into those fields. They keep their amendments stored further away. Just across the field on the left, they actually have a pastured poultry operation going on. But there's a pretty good buffer, at least of the road between where the produce fields are and where this pastured poultry is. And if you can kind of see, there's kind of a dip so that the water, unless there's just a heavy rain event or flood, you're not going to have major issues with that water coming off of that poultry operation and into the produce fields. It's generally going to flow down the back side of the property. So it's really good practice. One thing that we've discovered in our visits to farms over the last couple of years is wellhead management, making sure that people understand, how their wellhead is constructed so that we don't end up with issues in our water source. And something that we've identified that is more common than we would think is that wellheads are in cattle fields, and cattle have pretty easy access to around the wellhead. And as you might imagine, if there were an issue with the wellhead and cattle were freely roaming around that, and you had a heavy rain event, you could have water get into a well, which then could be, a contamination of that biological material. So on the right-hand side here, you can see there's actually a new company, which I don't have the company name listed. I meant to pull that in, but they've designed this cattle guard fencing so that cattle can't get close to the wellhead. And then if you're going to be having a well in an area where you have livestock, sometimes, it's already in place and you can't do anything about it. You just need a management strategy to deal with that. Do we have a question?
We do have a question in the chat, and Dr. Ingram and I both had to pull Google out. So we have a new term. I don't know if we'll know the answer. So Max asked, do you know how well mycofiltration works on controlling pathogens, or if it has been tested here in Arkansas yet?
I will say that's a new term for me as well. You know, we may not be able to answer this now, but we can look into that and maybe send a response after we look into, you know, what research is out there on the subject. We'd be happy to send a response back to that following our workshop. All right, so next up we have just talking about our irrigation system. So we talked about the wellhead and making sure that, you know, we don't have any issues around a wellhead. So here's an example from our friends at Oklahoma State Extension where they've mapped out what a typical kind of irrigation system might look like for a produce operation. And we're going to talk about what some of the risks might be in regards to this. So as you can see, kind of over here on the left, we've got, you know, our well pump. There's a backflow prevention system. There's a fertilizer solution tank where you're going to inject your fertilizer for your produce fields. That's going to, you know, the water and the fertilization is going to go through the system into the lines and out to the emitters to, you know, whatever type of produce you're growing in the field. So I just wanted to kind of open this up to the chat again for what are some of the potential problems that might occur in a produce field related to irrigation that could be a biological contamination. Surrounding land use, biofilms in the line. So what are some issues with surrounding land use to the irrigation system specifically, since we're talking about the irrigation system? Breaks in the lines. Okay. So what if, hit one tab, Samantha. Okay, so the first thing to think about is what our water source is. So is our water source a ground water source that's been tested and is coming back as a clean source? Or are we pumping from a pond, such as the blue dot that you see on the top of the screen there? And what is the quality of that water source? And then, you know, we talk about this in great deal in our produce safety program. You know, is that surface water that's being pumped into our irrigation lines, is that going to be just drip irrigation? It's not going to be coming in contact with that produce, because if so, then that reduces the risk. But what happens if there's a broken emitter? Someone want to enter that into the chat? What's the, you know, if you're using surface water, you have a broken emitter. Spraying on the produce, absolutely. All right, so it can come in contact with that produce, and if it's not of an adequate quality, then that can definitely lead to a contamination. So if that water is coming from the pond above and going into that system and there's a broken emitter, that can definitely cause a problem. And then if the pond is on land that is higher than, it's hard to tell that in a two-dimensional thing, but if in, you know, in a three-dimensional thing, if it is above the produce operation and you have heavy rains, you could have water kind of spilling out and into those produce fields. So that's a good observation. Samantha, hit the next one. All right, so what if we have a broken backflow prevention device? What can happen from those produce fields and into our irrigation lines? Everything becomes contaminated. So if you've got a backflow prevention device that either you don't have one or it's broken or there's an issue, you're going to be pulling in anything that's contaminated that field back into your system, and then you're going to be contaminating your well. Right, Cindy. Yeah. All right, next one, Samantha. All right, migratory birds flying in. So you've got a broken backflow prevention device. It's the season when you've got migratory birds flying in. They're dropping in the produce fields, and you notice, so you try to avoid that during harvest activities. But if your backflow prevention device is not working, you could have an issue with pulling some of that contamination into your system and then contaminating your well.
Amanda, we have a few more minutes and then we need to wrap up for the next presentation.
All right, we're almost done. One more thing here. So we did go out to a produce farm, and we heard that they had an issue with a wildlife intrusion with hogs, and the hogs came in and tore out their irrigation lines. Not just chewed on them, but actually ripped them out of the ground, and definitely caused some potential for issues. They were using surface water. Yeah, time for a hog roast, absolutely. They were using surface water, but they did have a backflow preventer. And fortunately, what they were growing was an orchard operation. So most of the things were growing off of the ground, but they had some sprays, and it was definitely an interesting experience for them, and really costly one as well. All right, Samantha. All right, so other things to think about are just the land use around the areas, how that might impact if you have heavy rains or floods. We'll go to the next one. And then we've got an example here. We'll share this out to everyone, and what the notes are on this as well, for how you just kind of assess some of the risks that are associated with the operation that you see in front of you. But we'll share that out to everyone as part of our notes at following the program. All right, just to cover this real quick, in this picture, because you're probably wondering, there are some emerging issues that we need to pay attention to. The dairy industry is really looking to innovate how they deal with animal welfare. And one of the recommended practices that I've just found out about recently, published in 2020, was cohabitation of vegetable operations and animals, and trying to use those nutrients in the same facility. So, more research to come on that, and what potential issues we might have regarding that. So thank you for your time today. And if you have any questions, please feel free to enter those in the chat, and I'll be happy to take them.